Hello, everyone. Today, our special guest Lisa is here. Lisa is an executive leadership coach from UK, and she is passionate to cultivate compassionate and psychologically safe and human-centered leadership. So today we'll learn human-centered leadership, and she has over 25 years of experience in NHS leadership, innovation, and strategic improvement, and she's dedicated her career to fostering healthier, happier, and more resilient workplaces. So today, thank you very much, Lisa, and we want to listen powerful insights from you. How leaders can move from burnout to a bold new approach to leadership, and to underscoring the transformative potential. So thank you very much. And Lisa, 25 years of experience in the leadership. How you will define your journey, long journey, uh, and also focus. If I will focus human-centered leadership, we want to learn from. We want to listen powerful insights from you. How
Thanks.
leaders can move from burnout to a bold new approach to leadership, and to underscoring the transformative potential. So thank you very much. And Lisa, 25 years of experience in the leadership. How you will define your journey, long journey, and also focus. If I will focus on the leadership, we want to
Thanks, Dr. Habib. It's great that you've asked me along. I've got a bit of feedback.
There is echo, yes, because Lisa, is there any other link of our YouTube channel or social media link is also open?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of feedback. I'm hearing different audios.
Yes, yes.
Thanks, Dr. Habib. It's great that you've asked me along. I've got a bit of
Lisa, please close YouTube or LinkedIn or Facebook live streaming. That is creating echo, I think so.
Yeah, and there's quite a bit of feedback. I'm hearing different audios. Let me just try and. Thanks, Dr. Habib. It's great that you've asked me along. I've got a bit of.
Lisa, please close YouTube or LinkedIn.
Okay, so that's all closed down. How does that sound now? Can you hear me okay?
Can you hear me now?
I can. Yes.
Ah, very nice, very nice. No, because that was the echo. The other link is live link is actually you playing. So okay, no, it's Lisa. Thank you very much for joining. To be very brief, 25 years of your experience. How you will say about your experience and also about the human-centered leadership. How you will say and what you want to share, please, about the leadership, human-centered leadership, and the crux of your 25 years long journey.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Habib. And like I said, sorry about that earlier interlude there with the sort of audios coming in. So it's great to be here. And just to give a little bit of a background on who I am and what I've experienced, I've worked in the NHS, the National Health System in the UK and Australia for over 30 years. Over 25 of those years, I've been leading healthy, high-performing teams. And I've also researched harassment and bullying in the NHS. And I think that's what's really driven my passion to create human-centered leadership, because I've seen over the course of that time what works and what doesn't work when it comes to leadership. And I think as we move forward into the future, having that human-centered approach to leadership is really, really crucial. And what I mean by human-centered leadership is, if we look through the lens of trauma and being trauma-informed, I think it's really important to bring that into leadership, because quite often I see within leadership and within my journey and with other leaders that leadership can look a lot more like management. And if you don't have that human connection in the workplace, you don't have psychological safety, you don't have that relational ways of leading and working with people, you don't have a sense of belonging, you don't have a sense of safety and feeling valued. That's what I'm talking about. That's what's needed now in the future. People are asking for this. Staff want this. They want that connection from leaders. And I think from a leader's perspective, we're able to create healthy, high-performing teams when we have that human connection. I've talked a lot about psychological safety over the years, and before it got coined by Amy Edmondson, I was implementing that many, many years ago based on the back of my research. We just didn't have the narrative back then to know what we were calling it. But for me, it was a bit of a non-negotiable to create a healthy space where my teams could thrive. I didn't always thrive myself because I find I was butting up against the systems that I was working within. And that's when, as in your title, From Burnout to Reclaiming Power, it's about how I've navigated through some of those tricky, toxic situations and toxic leadership that created burnout for me, and how I grew from that, and how I felt that I reclaimed my power. And that's what I help to support other leaders now on their journey.
Very nice. That's very nice. And Lisa, could you please share the moment in your career that shaped your understanding of the importance of addressing burnout and leadership? So, what was
Yeah.
that? And
Absolutely. So back in 2019, I just started a new role. I was a director of commissioning, opening up a brand new hospital, and I encountered a really unhealthy team dynamic. And part of my calling that out, as I said, I'd spent 20 years prior to that supporting people who'd felt bullied or harassed in the workplace. I'd done research on it as part of my master's degree. I'd set up independent services in the health service to support people. And I found myself in a situation where I was being targeted within this toxic team culture. And it was really, really harmful for me. And I think because I spoke up about it, I called it out, I encountered the full force of the organization of who did not want to disclose this toxic culture. And I was the seventh person to have been targeted in 2 years. So I was uncovering lots of this toxic behavior. And in that process of speaking out, there was almost felt like a secondary trauma from HR who weren't there to support me. And I suffered some dreadful burnout from that whole experience. But what I discovered after that experience, I got really curious as to what happened, what was happening in my body during that time. And I channeled all that into a book, and it's taken quite a few years, but I'll be releasing that at the end of this year. And it's just how we're physically impacted when we're going through bullying or harassment in the workplace. But as I said, it got me really curious. And then I decided to do an investigation, and I reached out and spoke to over 50 people on LinkedIn. And I made the link between toxic end of bullying, complex PTSD, and suicide ideation. And I also discovered that men who experience bullying or harassment in the workplace experience that differently as well. And especially if men are being bullied by women, it creates a lot of shame. So I was starting to uncover this huge amounts of data that just got me even more curious to go further with this. And I think that was really the start of my reclaiming my power, turning my experience of burnout into a learning opportunity, because the more knowledge that I had about what was happening to me at that time meant that I felt empowered when I knew what was happening to my brain, for example. So I'll just give you a short snippet. So for example, when we're experiencing bullying or harassment in a toxic environment, the part of our brain, the amygdala, registers this psychological abuse almost as if it's physical abuse. It doesn't differentiate whether it's physical abuse or psychological abuse. The body registers it in a painful way. And once I understood that my amygdala was inflamed, I was seeing danger everywhere. And because this was a repeated behavior, then the amygdala becomes like a faulty fire alarm, and it just sees danger everywhere. So you're hypervigilant, you feel like you're in fight or flight constantly, you're fighting on all sides, and your nervous system cannot calm down. And part of my recovery from that and healing was understanding I needed to rest my brain. And as a very close colleague of mine and a friend, a mental health professional, said, it's like your brain's inflamed. If you were a runner and you banged your knee, you would rest it for 6 weeks. You need to do the same thing with your brain and reduce the inflammation. And it's not that you ever, for anybody who's out there listening to this who've experienced being bullied or harassed in the workplace, it's not that it ever goes away. And this is where I like to bring in the trauma-informed lens, because it's not about it's not about understanding sort of, you know, who you are in the workplace. It's understanding what's happened to you. It's how you show up with that wound that you've experienced, I'd say, from the workplace, and how you use that as a learning opportunity. So it doesn't ever really go away, but you grow from it. And that's what happened to me. And then that made me feel so much more empowered then to help others, to share what I had discovered. And when I found I started sharing that with people, then people were really helping themselves to heal. It's not that I could do anything for them other than just to share this information, and it would help them to feel more empowered on their journey. So that's how the transition happened for me. And it feels like such a deep calling that I just have to keep going with this regardless, because it just feels such a powerful and personal journey that I'm on. And I've just seen so many people who've been harmed from working in toxic environments that I can't ignore it any longer. And obviously, coming from a healthcare background, we also have the data to show how toxic cultures within healthcare directly impact patient care.
Very nice. Lisa, that's very inspiring for the audience who want to avoid this kind of toxic bullying behaviors. You mentioned about this behaviors. What kind of behaviors, specific behaviors, so that the women, if they are bullied by the men, they can understand that and how to tackle those bullying behaviors, because there are different kind of bully. And also, it was interesting you mentioned that men also bullied by a woman. This is also interesting how men can be like that. And the data you want to share, please. What are the statistics, and whether it is in UK or all the behaviors you observed in UK, and are it's recent years, or it's long time ago or something? Is there any trend change in recent years, or yet is the same situation?
So when I think back to the research that I did 23 years ago, I would say, because I've specifically looked at healthcare in the UK, and that's the data that I've looked at. Although I've worked in Australia, I would say the culture was pretty similar. And in terms of has it got better or has it got worse, the data shows that it's got worse. So in healthcare in the UK, we spend it was estimated as part of a research study back in 2018 that we spend 2.2 billion pounds every year on harassment and bullying costs. And we know the data shows only about 50% of people speak up. Most people will just leave quietly because they don't want to cause a fuss and they don't want it to impact their next job. So we know as well from the data that there's a lot more bullying that happens to women. And women on women bullying is rife as well. So whilst women will get bullied by men, there's a lot of data to show that women on women bullying is quite profound. And I think there's more research that's needed to look into some of those reasons. And absolutely, when it comes to men being bullied by women, we don't really have much data on that. But when I did this investigation back in 2020, that then just started to show how men experience that and how suicide ideation comes into that toxic form of bullying. Because especially if a man's being bullied by a woman, it brings up shame, and they reframe it in their mind in terms of, I'm having a challenging situation at work. One guy I spoke to didn't tell his wife for 2 years. And on his commute into work, a 2-hour commute, he passed out at the wheel on the motorway. How he didn't crash, I don't know. So that's what happened. And then another colleague that I spoke to, he was being bullied by a woman. And again, he ended up just having a complete crash and a breakdown on the way into work one day. Another young man I spoke to, father of 2 young children, found himself on the beach in the middle of the night wanting to walk into the water because he just couldn't cope with that toxic behavior any longer. Now, when it comes to those behaviors, it's really interesting. So in the UK especially, harassment is illegal. Any form of harassment of the protected characteristics is illegal. Bullying isn't illegal. But I would argue that bullying behavior is what connects both of them, because in order to create harassment for somebody, you're using toxic bullying behavior. It's just that you're targeting a protected characteristic, whether that's gender, whether that's age, whether that's sex, whether it's religion. You know, there's a list of those that people can look at. In terms of the behaviors, I think one of the reasons that it's difficult to make bullying illegal is that it can be different for different people. But if you're basically looking at, there's a consistent behavior that's negative towards you, and you've either asked it to stop and it continues to be repeated, and you start to get worn down. So I liken it to, it's a dripping tap effect. So for example, if we walk through the organization door and we got hit by a large piece of wood by somebody, we would know that is abuse. We've walked into the workplace, we've been abused physically. But when you're being abused psychologically, and most of this is done behind closed doors, and so there's no witnesses. Sometimes if it's witnessed, it could look like passive aggressive behavior, lots of demeaning comments. It could be giving one colleague more work than the other consistently. It could also be taking work off people and giving them really low level work and not giving them any opportunities. So there's lots of subtle nuances here. And within that as well, there's also some subtleties of, say, for example, if we were in the workplace and you observed me being bullied by a colleague and you didn't speak up, then people are reporting that they have a moral injury. Now that term comes from war, where people have gone to war and they've acted out of their morals or their character, and they've done things that they wouldn't normally do, and they walk away with this moral injury. And the same thing happens with bullying and harassment in the workplace. People become bystanders. They observe what happens. They're scared that if they put their hand up or their head above the parapet, they could be the next target, and they stay quiet, and it creates this moral wound within them. So the ripple effect of this toxic behavior in the workplace just is so far reaching around colleagues, around families. It's something that in today's workplace, there's no room for it. There's just absolutely no room for it.
Lisa, you mentioned about it's that it's behind the closed doors and no witness, and also is the colleagues. You mentioned about the colleagues. Mostly the colleagues are the bosses or something like that, and definitely to block the opportunities to for the promotion. Something this is directly related to, definitely colleagues can also support this phenomena. And this ripple effect, how this ripple effect, also this ripple effect affecting the other families. I mean, it goes to the families or something. It is on the end, I'm very surprised that the laws are very strict, and even when we try to get the job, there are harassment. If you have any case in the harassment, you have very strict you can see process. So how is this happening? It's very strange to listen from you.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because it happens behind closed doors. I think there's an abuse of power dynamic behind it. That's what I researched and that's what I uncovered. And especially in the NHS, it's a hierarchical system. And that hierarchical system, if you like, supports the abuse of power. I've also observed over the years people moving into management and leadership positions that haven't necessarily got the right skills or ability to build psychological safety, but they move up in the hierarchy, and the higher up they move, the more chaos that they create. In terms of the ripple effect, so I can speak from personal experience. When I was having that awful experience, my husband got so frustrated because he was on the outside observing me being harmed and he couldn't do anything about it. And I would come home and I'd offload to him, and he would feel so frustrated because he couldn't fix it. You know, he couldn't support me in that way, he couldn't protect me. And he felt harmed by it as well, because he felt powerless. And then, of course, it's a knock-on effect then to our families and our children, because when you're not fully present at home because of what's going on in the workplace, because it does just take over your life, you're constantly ruminating and thinking about what's happened, how you should have responded, how you can protect yourself. I mean, I often would go into work and I would be in my car feeling like I was putting on armor to go into the workplace, you know, to have battles in these meetings, and not fun battles, not kind of healthy conflict, but really toxic, harmful attacks. And so you take that stuff home with you. You know, if anybody has had those moments on a Sunday evening when you're dreading going into work the next day, you know, it's that feeling, and that feeling ripples out to our family. And then I think in terms of we've got policies to deal with harassment and bullying in the NHS, but it's really hard to prove it. Even if, so what I would say to people, and what I've done myself, is you always document and bring together evidence as to what's happened. So you're trying to show a build-up and a picture of behavior and evidence to go alongside that. And that's really what you need to have. And for some people, that's really difficult to pull together, especially if you're feeling traumatized from the experience, and especially because it's done behind closed doors. So that's difficult. And if you ask colleagues to speak up, they might not want to speak up because they don't want to then be the next in line. So it can be really tricky for some people to pull together that evidence, and whether they've got the motivation and energy to do it as well. So when you look at the policies and procedures, we do have those in place, but quite often this is where HR gets involved. And HR's role is to protect the organisation from litigation, and that's completely fine. It's just HR now is dressed up as people and culture, and we're here to support you. And I didn't find they were there to support me. And so many people say the same thing. And then that experience with HR can feel very dehumanizing and adds almost like an organization betrayal. You'll quite often hear people say they felt there was an organization betrayal, that HR wasn't there to back them up, because HR want to get rid of the problem person speaking up. They want to make sure that the organization is safe from litigation, and they will use the policies, and they become weaponized in some ways, and they know how difficult it is to prove bullying. So they'll encourage people to go down that route, knowing they can always find ways out of it to protect the person who's the aggressor in the workplace. And quite often you find people who've done this over decades, and HR's done nothing about it.
There's and also here someone commented here that Saad mentioned that I already faced that when I was in Ireland by the director himself, along with something like that.
Yeah.
So these kind of cases, and you mentioned, Lisa, that this is mostly specific to the NHS, and what's the solution? So no, if we can. Because sometimes I listened that if, for example, if the woman is bullied by the man, and a woman, if artificial, for example, artificial scratches on her body, if this will also be serve as the proof that someone harmed that. So some people can manipulate the situation, some people can strengthen their evidence. If they don't have the evidence, they can create the artificial something. What do you think about this kind of situation?
If people was creating false evidence?
Yes.
I mean, I think again that because it's so hard to pin this down, if somebody was creating false evidence, then I think you'd see through that, because what you want to show is a continuous build-up of this picture. So I think when I often go in and I work with organizations and say I'll talk about harassment and bullying, quite often the leadership will be like, we don't want to give people the wrong impression. We don't want people speaking up. We don't want people making false accusations. And you might get one or two that comes through, but you can see through that because there's no evidence to back it up. Especially if it's, I mean, I guess the example that you gave just then sounded like it could have been more like sexual harassment. If somebody was a male colleague had physically attacked a female colleague, then that would come under the term of harassment, because it's about gender and it's about physical assault. So I think it's about having the evidence for that, and if it's fabricated, I think most people can tend to see through that. So I wouldn't, if you're a leader listening to this message, I wouldn't worry about opening the floodgates and asking people to be more open about your culture and behavior, because I think sometimes that's the fear for organizations. They don't want these false accusations to come through, but actually you might find a little increase at the start, but then you'll start to see the true culture then coming through, and your staff will appreciate that you're opening those floodgates and you're having the conversation about culture, and that then will start to build psychological safety and that sense of connection, which is what I started talking about at the beginning, about that human-centered future. And then in terms of some of the solutions, I'm doing some work at the moment with a colleague looking at team agreements, and it's a really simple way how you can use team agreements, not a charter to sign up to, it's not values, organization values, it's practical ways to pull teams together and say what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and holding everybody to account. And it's done on a fortnightly basis, so it's live, it's dynamic, it's powerful, and it really helps to clean up that culture. And harassment and bullying can't exist in those spaces. So that's one tool that I use with organizations. And also something else that I use as an executive leadership coach, I go in and I actually do one-to-one support with the leader, because we know from the data that most bullying comes from that frontline management relationship. So the manager to the subordinate is where most of it happens, like 85% of it happens. And there's some colleague on colleague and some subordinate bullying. So I will go in and I'll provide targeted intervention. I'll work with the person. He's either been accused of having bullying behavior, and for some people, they might accidentally fall into that behavior pattern because of stress, because of performance pressure. And I can work with them to course correct that, almost like by holding up a mirror to say, look, this is how you're coming across. How can we adapt and soften some of these behaviors so you can still get a high performing team, but you can change the perception of some of these behaviors. I also work with groups and I do group reflective practice. So again, for me, it's about how can you go into the heart of that team and be really open and honest about the culture, about the behavior, and about how you can get that team to work together in a really healthy dynamic. It's not about the absence of conflict. It's not about the absence of being direct with each other. We can do all of those things. We can do them compassionately, and some of the things that I'm talking about many years ago, for some people, used to feel a bit soft and fluffy and a bit feminine and we don't do that. We do more kind of masculine leadership, command and control. But actually, there's nothing soft about these skills. You've got to have courage. And I'm a real fan of compassionate leadership, but I'm a real fan of courageous leadership, because we can't have compassionate leadership without courage to go with it, to really tackle these behaviors. So that's what I do. And I try to encourage healthy conflict within teams, and also understanding the dynamic of power and where you've got that power imbalance, and how you can start to encourage more power with each other rather than power over, because that's a big part of it as well.
That's nice. And also from the human-centered leadership, also the trauma-informed leadership is also gaining significant attention. And how can this be transformed to the leaders so that they can integrate it to their organizations? How is possible? And what's the human-centered leadership and trauma-informed? These are the two different things, or it's the umbrella of the other, something like that?
So this slightly different. If we start with trauma-informed leadership, and lots of people have been talking about this recently, and if we think the crux of trauma-informed leadership is that when you have a trauma-informed lens, you don't say what's wrong with you, metaphorically speaking. You say what happened to you. So as a leader, I wouldn't be looking at my member staff thinking, why aren't you performing? What's wrong with you? I would be more curious and think, what's happened to you? Have you had a bereavement in the family? Have you got a health diagnosis that you're working with? If I had a good rapport and a connection with my team, I would know upstream as to what's going wrong with that person and what's happened in their life. And then I can support them, whether that's giving them extra coaching or support that they need to take some time to stand back and be with their family, whatever the situation is. That's what trauma-informed leadership looks like in action, because you're trying to understand what's happened to you rather than what's wrong with you. And that feels very different. And then I've been working with some psychologists around this, and because there's lots of people talking about trauma-informed leadership, we're now talking about relational informed leadership, which is is a step on from trauma-informed leadership, because what we're trying to identify through trauma-informed leadership is understanding how does this whole person show up in front of me, and rather than me just assuming there's something wrong with them, I'm curious to understand what's happened to them and why they're showing up this way today. The relational ways of leadership are then starting to talk about and lean into psychological safety. How can I relate to my team in a human way? And lots of people don't know what psychological safety means. So I like to think psychological safety is like the tip of the iceberg. And the building blocks underneath it are, how can I create human connection with another human being in my team, see them as a human, understand through a trauma-informed lens what's happened to them? How can I create a sense of belonging? How can I make my team members feel valued? How can I create trust and safety? They're the actual building blocks that creates psychological safety. So, and that's sometimes the bit that people kind of miss. They think, we're a psychologically safe environment. I've had healthcare professionals telling me, I tell my team every week that this it's psychologically safe. And it's like, it doesn't matter what you say, you've got to walk your talk. People don't watch your mouth, they watch your feet. They watch what you do, how you walk your talk. And so human-centered relationships and human-centered leadership is about, how do we bring all of that together? And in the workplace, how do we relate to each other as human beings, understanding we have a job to achieve? And if somebody's not performing, I would want to be curious and understand why. What's different this week to last week? How they're showing up? How can I, as a leader, support them rather than penalize them? And I found, after decades of experience, when you treat people like that way, you get more from them. You get 150, 200%. If you treat them like a machine, if you treat them like there's somebody they've got something wrong with them, you'll get 50%, 60%. So I find the human-centered ways of relating is where you're going to get a healthier, high-performing team in the future.
Yeah, nice. That's, and also here Saad already mentioned that in Ireland, the director of education department himself, along with his PhD student, I can confirm that the behavior really demotivated me. Now his question is that how to deal with the person up in the hierarchy and what options subordinates have before going legally in the UK. I'm preparing to move to the UK, so it's very important for me to know upfront. So could you please comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that this behaviour is endemic. It's across all organisations. So I wouldn't say it's worse in the UK. Obviously, in the NHS, we do have this hierarchy system, and I think as somebody showing up to work with somebody, then you can also create human-centered leadership from bottom up. It doesn't have to be top down. It might be that you're supporting your boss or your leader to understand this is what you want as an employee. I would look into team agreements, and I can share some things on that with your audience as well. And I would say it's about, how do you show up on your first day with your boss, also explaining your needs as an employee. This is what's important to me. What's important to me is having a good human connection with you. I would like to know what your expectations are for me. And these are my expectations. It's a two-way street. Quite often we turn up into the workplace and it's that top down. This is what I expect. Do the work, complete the tasks. This is the outcome. This is the output. But now is the time for us to have that dynamic conversation and say, as an employee, this is what I value. This is what I'm interested in. And that could be part of your interviewing technique as well. we ask about what are your organizational values, and sometimes you'll be asked as an interviewee, what's your values, how do they align with ours? That's great. I'm interested in the next steps after that, because organizational values still, in my mind, sit on a wall. They sit on a letterhead. I want to know how they walk those values. So part of what I would say is to turn up and say, this is what's important to me. These are my values. This is how I work. If you want to get the best out of me, this is how I appreciate working with you. And that could look like, I want to feel like I belong in the team. I want to feel like you acknowledge the work that I put forward. I want you to make me feel like I'm valued, like I've got a sense of belonging. So that's what I would have in that first, almost like it's a contract, isn't it? Because we have this paper contract with organizations, but we also have an emotional contract, and we never talk about that. What we're talking about here is that's the emotional contract, and maybe that's the narrative we need to start talking about. What's the emotional contract that we want from our team? And what does that look like? How is it going to make each people in the team feel? And that's what team agreements, in a way, creates a framework to start having those conversations.
That's nice. Emotional contract. That's very nice to include. And could you please share some brief example or the story or some case studies of successful implementation of this compassionate leadership and this kind of cultures from your experience? Have you observed these kind of still existing, or it still need a aggressive kind of workout to implement it, please?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so last year, I was asked by a mental health charity to pull together a compassionate leadership course. And when I look back over my career, I thought, if I had to start again, you've got all your MBA leadership type courses, and you've got your how do you manage and lead through change and all that kind of stuff. But I thought, okay, what have I observed that's gone wrong? And what would I put in place as the antidote to that, the safety net, the preventative piece? And I came up with this course, and it's been rolled out now with an executive leadership team and also emerging leaders. And the feedback on that has been absolutely fantastic. Now, what I find, I've got examples of that in the NHS, but they're pockets of examples. So it's like the honeycomb effect. I've seen pockets of really good practice within a wider organization, but it doesn't often go to the top. I can give you a really great example of somebody who was very senior in the NHS and was a mentor of mine. And I think this is a great example of what compassionate, human-centered culture looks like in action. And we had a mentor meeting scheduled, and I traveled. I'm living outside London at the moment in South Wales. So it's like a 2-hour journey into London. I traveled into London to see this person for our session. And they were very senior in the NHS, and they weren't able to see me for the session. But they turned up at 1:00 when our meeting was scheduled, and they said, come on in. They welcomed me. We had a chat, and they said, I'm just on a call. And it was a really important, because this person was very senior in the NHS, on a really important work call that was very public in the news at that time. And they said, I'm just on this call. I'm going to be about 20 minutes. Go and grab a cup of tea, and I'll come and have a chat with you. So I felt seen. I felt valued. I felt that I was a human being, worthy of this person turning up on time, even though they were in the middle of a really busy crisis, a very public one. And 20 minutes later, I just sat down, had a cup of tea. They came along. We had a 5-10 minute catch up, and they said, I'm going to have to go back. I've got another call. Not a problem. I walked away, even though I'd invested a lot of time and effort in that meeting. I walked away feeling, like I said earlier, a sense of being valued. There was the human connection, feeling of belonging. I felt heard, I'd felt seen. And I'd been communicated to very clearly about what was happening. And I understood. And that could have gone a completely different way. Most times, what we would experience is turning up after making that effort and being told by that person's PA, they're too busy, they can't see you, go away. And I would have walked away feeling kind of aggrieved in some sort of way that I'd made all that effort, and They didn't even have the decency to show up and say what was going on. So that's why I always give that example, because it was just such a beautiful example of what that compassionate leadership looks like. And they didn't need to do that, but they did, because that was who that person is, and that's the way that they operate.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. That's and also, Lisa, you mentioned about that the cameras. Yeah, there is the work environment where the cameras are available. Is there any lack of because in UK, I think everywhere you will see the cameras or something like that. So in this situation where cameras are installed and everything, so what kind of proof are still needed? Is there any deficiency you feel like that, or cameras can save these kind of bullying and harassment?
So I think with cameras, I mean, I suppose it depends if you've got audio with it, because again, if you've just got a camera observing people's behavior, then you're not going to see the nuances of the passive aggressive behavior, the slants, the things that people are saying about you or to you. The one thing I think is really interesting, I've been working with a company who have got an AI platform, and basically every week employees, it's anonymous, all employees would enter into that platform. It's a set of driver tree algorithms, and it asks you a series of questions, completely anonymous, and the output of that is that it creates a heat map, and it shows you where there's antisocial behavior within the organization. I think that's really interesting, because whilst you might not have that individual, this is what's happened to me, here's the evidence. You have that information as an organization to say, we know the heat, the antisocial behavior heat always comes up in this department. What are we doing about it? And that cleans up culture very, very quickly, because there's a psychological effect called the Hawthorne effect. When people are being observed, they behave differently. So whether that's been observed by cameras or whether it's been observed by AI platforms that people can report, then people will change their behavior very, very quickly. And that gives organizations the data that they need to go into particular teams and clean up that culture. They might be able to look at that organization and say, well, we know we've got a change program going on in that department. We know we've got some redundancies in that department. So we're going to expect a little bit of heat. But if you've got consistent heat, and every single good operational manager knows where the heat comes from. We all know the problem, people who behave in really toxic ways. It's quite often they don't have the courage to deal with them.
Yes, yes, please. Please
Yeah.
continue.
Yeah. So I think that's when I think AI platforms will be really helpful in the future, because as part in Europe, the ESG compliance that's come in on the 1st of January, the S part of that is antisocial behaviour. And now, whilst in the UK, we're not part of the EU, but our supply chains in the NHS are, they're asking organisations to prove how they are preventing antisocial behaviour in the workplace, and huge fines are coming down the line that organisations, if they're not tackling it, it's going to affect their reputation. The data will go directly to the chairperson, who is responsible for the reputation management of the organisation, and it will be part of their responsibility to help to clean up that culture very, very quickly. So that's something that I think would be very interesting to observe, how that changes things in the future, and far more powerfully than just cameras. Because what we do know, and what I found out from my research 23 years ago, is that this antisocial behavior in the workplace has to be tackled systemically rather than individually. Individual pockets doesn't clean it up. We need to tackle it systemically, and it is a systemic problem, especially in healthcare. And across the UK, to look at outside healthcare, now we spend, I think it's £28.9 billion every year on harassment and bullying costs. So it's equivalent to £1,000 per person in the UK. And that's based on data of full-time employees rather than part-time. And like I said, and we know only half, people will speak up, 50% of people will speak up. So we know that that's underreported.
Yes, that's thought provoking, and I can say. And Lisa, the final message you want to convey to the women who are bullied or harassed by men, or they are expected that it is possible, and the vice versa, if men are harassed by or bullied by the women. So what are the final message and conclusive message before ending this session you want to share, please?
So I think the final message is that disempowering behavior like this has no place in the workplace at all. And I think the future of leadership, with that AI especially coming in, these human-centered, high emotional intelligent skills are going to be valued more than ever. And if we want to create healthy, high-performing workplaces, these are the skills that are needed for the leaders of the future. And the organizations who don't adapt quickly to that are the organizations that won't retain the best talent. So I think there's a choice that we all have as leaders and employees as to what's acceptable at work and what isn't.
Yes, and Lisa, what individual roles, for example, at the leadership level and at the employees level? Okay, for the leadership level, you mentioned that okay, otherwise the talent will not be there and it will go anywhere. And at employees level, what suggestions you want to share to the who are the women or the men bullied or harassed? What message you want to convey, please?
Yeah, so I think for the individual perspective, this is about your own personal power, and I think that's what gets challenged in the workplace. So if you feel your power, your position, you're targeted, your role is targeted, I would say have a clear documentation of what's been happening so you can build up a picture. What's really important is that you reclaim your power. Don't stay in that situation for such a long time that you feel completely disempowered. You always have the option to reclaim your power. And I've got a free resource on my website that helps people to reclaim their power, but also then to lead with a regulated nervous system, because that's one of the things that was important for me when I realized my nervous system was going haywire. So that's a free resource that's out there to help people. But I would say most importantly, do not let your mental health and well-being suffer from being disempowered in the workplace. You do have options, you do have choices, and I'm always happy to help people to navigate those tricky situations, because your health is more important than staying in a toxic work environment. And I know sometimes it's not that easy to leave when you've got financial commitments. I've been there, but there are ways that you can reclaim your power and you can move on from that and create a healthy workplace, and a role that's going to help serve you rather than disempower you.
That's very nice. And Lisa, here is the I want to share to the audience that here is the this one is your book. You mentioned, I think so, that you published the book. Yeah, this is the book.
So that's in the pipeline, and that's called The Physiology of Bullying, and that looks at how bullying and harassment affects us physically and why it's so damaging to our health and well-being as humans.
That's nice. That's nice. And also, the Lisa, if someone want to contact Lisa, so here is the LinkedIn profile. You can contact anyone through this, and that's very nice, Lisa. That's really nice, and it was an enlightening and inspiring discussion. And thanks for your time to share this valuable perspective today. And really nice to listen these kind of things, and hopefully it will your sharing and your impact on the at organization level, at the leadership level, definitely prevent these kind of issues in the near future. And again, thank you for your time, and absolute privilege having you with us. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Dr. Habib. I've loved every moment of it. Thank
Thank
you.
you.